a real famous debate that we have in terms of whether or not the avos were the ones that instituted the prayers, or whether we institute the amount of prayers based on the avos or based on the korbanos. Okay, then we have Ezi Mincha Gdula. So what's Mincha Gdula? So they say from 6.5 hours. So if we start counting from sunrise and count 6.5 hours, that's the first time you could daven, and that's called Mincha Gdula. Okay, Mincha Ketana, right? And it's called Gadol because you have a lot of time to pray, and it's called Katan because you only have a small amount of time to pray, right? Because Mincha Ketana starts 9.5 hours into the day, since you only have until sunset to pray, right? So then you're only going to have a shorter amount of time to pray. Okay, now here's our first question comes up. So here you have a different phrase. Okay, see, he says that hold on, look at it. The tefillos were always mitaken, right? And that was the same word that was used originally, right? So I always get confused how to do this, but okay, if you look at the first line, so it says that it uses the word takana, which is like an institution, to institute something, right? So here he says it was instituted by way of the forefathers, but Asmechinihu, right? They relied on, okay, they were somechan, they relied on the korbanos. So that interplay of, well, they instituted based on one, but they were reliant on the korbanos. So what does that mean, right? So in other words, they're sort of like accepting both, but only putting, like one of them on the, only saying that one of them is our source, and the other one we're like being so as add-on. So that whole interplay is very strange, right? What does that mean? So that's our first question. Okay, so let's look at how the Rambam views this. Okay, the Rambam says as follows. The Rambam says that we've already said that tefillas mincha is like the Tamid Shoba and Arbayim, right? So, and the Rambam comes ahead, he said, right, and this is very clear. We saw this in the sources already, right? That in the introductory shiur, I don't want to go through each source again and again, but the Rambam says that really the ideal time for mincha, is mincha ketana, is from 9.5 hours, not mincha gedola. He says that if you daven mincha gedola, right? So then, if you look at this last line in source number 2, he says you're yotze, right? He says you're over there somewhere. Okay, so he says you're yotze, right? But he only says you're yotze. Yotze means that you fulfilled your obligation, but it's not the way that you should be doing it. You're yotze, okay, fine. So that's right. That's the best that it's going to be. Is just you're yotze. Okay, so but then he says something weird. He says, but when you get to Mincha Gdola from 6.5 hours, now it's the time that you're obligated to daven Mincha. And we're going to see this question fleshed out a little even more, but he seems to be going back and forth in terms of how do you have the times Chiyuv. We'll look at that again, but that should be somewhat confusing. Okay, so that's the Rambam, and so the Rambam is very clear. His opinion is that you should ideally daven mincha ketana, and mincha gdola is only in, I guess, like if you have to, right? That's it. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch in source number 4 we saw he agrees with the Rambam, and he says that ideally one should only daven mincha ketana, they should not daven mincha gdola. And the Mishnah Berurah we saw he gives background to this. And he says as follows. He says that really everything is based on the korbanos. All the tefillos and the Zman tefillos are based on the korbanos, right? That's where this comes from. So if it comes from the korbanos, so when was the Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim given? When was that korban offered? Right? That's the question. When was the korban offered? So the korban was offered at 9.5 hours. It was Ben Harabayim, which means like in the late afternoon, like around sunset time, a little before sunset. That was the ideal time it was given. Now, on Erev Pesach, you had a big rush in the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara spends pages talking about how big of a rush it was on Erev Pesach and everything that went on Erev Pesach. So on a normal Erev Pesach, they would do this korban, the korban Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim, earlier in the day. They usually do it about an hour earlier, not more than that, okay? But when Erev Pesach fell on Shabbos, because there was such a rush, because there was so much going on, they had to bring the korban tamid even earlier in the day in order to make sure that everybody's korban pesach would be offered. So in order to ensure that everybody's korban pesach would be offered, they had to go even earlier in the day to make sure that the korban tamid shel ben arbaim. So now the door's open. Right now the door is open, so now we can give give the korban mincha earlier, which means that if tefillas mincha is based on the korban mincha, right, of the tamid shel ben arbaim, so now we could daven mincha earlier. Okay, so what's the problem now, right? Once you could do something, so then go ahead and do it. What are you going to tell me? So really, you could look at it and say, no, where the Rambam's coming from, he's saying that, look, yeah, 100%. Once every couple of years, this was done. Right? It has to be when Erev Pesach fell out on Erev Shabbos. It doesn't happen every year. It happens every couple of years. So every couple of years, one time, they would daven Mincha early in the day at Mincha Gdולה. But that's not when Mincha was supposed to be done, or else they'd be doing it all the time. Really, Mincha should be done in 9.5 hours. So that's our that's an important point. Okay. So that's the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah. Going on, you see the Beis Yosef, the Torah and the Beis Yosef. So the Torah takes a different approach to this. Right? The Torah says that, nope, ideally, you can daven mincha at Mincha Gdולה. Once that door is open, he holds that you can go ahead and no problem. Right? This is, there's no issue here. You can daven early. Right? That's the idea. So he says, right? He says, right? And the Beis Yosef points out that there's this is a debate between the Rambam and the Rosh in the Torah. Right, so this is a debate. Okay, you have a machlokas rishonim, which begs our next question of, okay, so is Mincha Gdולה ideal or is it not ideal? What's the debate between the Torah and the Rambam? Okay, everybody good so far? Got this? Okay, great. Okay, nothing new here, really. Okay, okay. So then we're gonna run into a problem here. Okay, and the problem is like this. Here's the problem. Okay. When the Chachamim come up with a halacha, okay, so when they institute a din d'Rabbanan, so the Chacham can't do whatever they want, right? Their dinim they have to be based somewhere. Ideally, you should be able to track their dinim all the way back to one of the Taryag mitzvahs, one of the 613 mitzvahs. Okay, so the Chacham can't. When the Chacham come up with something that's a mitzvah or like a din d'Rabbanan or a prohibition, a gzera. So you have to be able to find where that comes from. They can't just create it out of nowhere, which means that if you have evidence of a din d'Rabbanan, of a gzera d'Rabbanan, if you see a gzera d'Rabbanan, you see something that the Chachamim say you're not allowed to do this, and from the Torah it's perfectly permissible. So your question has to be, okay, if they're going to say this, so what's generating their prohibition, right? What's creating this prohibition? They couldn't have come up with this on their own, right? So where did this come from? Okay, so a prohibition on its own is just sort of like the tip of the iceberg, right? That means that if you keep looking down, you're going to find it's really opposite. If you keep looking, then you like trail upwards, then you're going to find some other din has to exist. Okay, so here I use the Rambam here just because it's clear, but everybody agrees to these halachos. Okay, there are certain things the Chachamim instituted that you're not allowed to do before you daven. Now, I just want to make sure this is not our topic, but it's important to recognize there's a difference between things you're not allowed to do before you daven shacharis in the morning and things you're not allowed to do before you daven mincha and mariv. The halachos that you're not allowed to do something before mincha mariv, those are generated out of a fear that you're going to forget to daven mincha mariv. You're going to get caught up in something and you're going to forget. Shacharis is not like that. And that's why the halachos of what you're not allowed to do before you daven shacharis are much stricter, because there's even opinions that hold that the prohibitions of what you're not allowed to do on shacharis are from the Torah, they're daraisas, and that you'd be violating a daraisa if you did something before you daven shacharis. And again, practical halacha, we're not talking about now. The whole questions, there's a lot of questions about practically. But just we should know that there is a prohibition of doing something before you daven mariv, and there are prohibitions, shacharis, and there's prohibitions before you daven mincha and mariv. But the prohibitions of daven mincha and mariv stem from one fear. Okay, it's not that there's a prohibition like in shacharis that you're not allowed to do anything before you daven. That's the shacharis' thing. But in Mincha, you're not allowed to do certain things before Mincha, only out of fear that you're going to forget to daven Mincha. Okay, is that clear? Right, that's important for our next step here. Okay, if we see that there's a prohibition of doing certain things before Mincha, and we know it's not like Shacharis, where in Shacharis I'm not allowed to do something because there's a prohibition of taking care of my own needs before I pray to God. Okay, that's a prohibition. In other words, I shouldn't be concerned with, I should be concerned with my own blood that's in God's hands before I start worrying about making a living and doing other things. Okay, that's having fun, whatever it is, having a meal, right? That's the shachar. So we know that doesn't apply to Mincha because it's not logical to think that way at Mincha. Now I see that there are halachos that I'm not allowed to do something before Mincha because I might forget to daven Mincha. Okay, but that can only be true. These prohibitions can only be true, and they can only stand if there was a time where I had to daven Mincha. Right? That must mean that there's a certain time, not where I have to daven Mincha by time X, but I must daven Mincha at time X. Meaning at this point, right now, once the clock hits whatever hour it is, right? So at that point, now I must daven Mincha. And as long as I'm not davening Mincha, there's a problem, whatever the problem might be, that's going to say that now I can't do the following actions. Everybody understand? Okay? I don't think this is so complicated, but I think it's important to point this out. Okay, evidence of a start time for Mincha is we were asking the question, what is the earliest time I could daven Mincha? But that's not really what our question should be. By the fact that we see that there are prohibitions of doing something until I daven Mincha, my question should really be, what time do I have to daven Mincha? When does the clock start ticking that now I have to daven Mincha? What would I call that? I would call that the Zman chiyuva. If we remember earlier, that's the language that the Rambam used. The Rambam said that Mincha Gdula is not ideal, right? That earlier Mincha time is not ideal, but it's Zman chiyuva starts at the time of Mincha Gdula, at the earlier time, which puts me in, and we explained this in the introductory shiur, this puts me in a catch-22. On the one hand, the Rambam is saying that there's a Zman chiyuva, that there's a time I must start davening now. When should that time be? So if I was looking at the Rambam, I'd say that time should be at 9.5 hours, right? At the Mincha Ketana. But that's not what we're saying. We're saying, when is it? The Rambam saying at Mincha Gdula. Why should there be a prohibition, according to the Rambam, starting at Mincha Gdula? It should start at Mincha Ketana. It should start at the 9.5 hours, not at 6.5 hours, right? So by the fact that the Rambam has these prohibitions, and everybody has these prohibitions, right? And the fact that we're saying that they start at 6.5 hours, that puts us in a conundrum of trying to understand what the Rambam is saying. Good? Does everybody understand? Right, okay, this is clear, this question. This is our third question. In other words, what it's really asking is, what I'm trying to understand is Mincha Gdula, when we say that Mincha Gdula, you can daven at the 6.5 hours, but I'm also saying that's the obligatory start time of Mincha Gdula. So is Mincha Gdula a time that I can start davening or that I must start davening? And if I must start davening, if we're going to go with that approach, right, which would make more sense, would be more in the line when we say that it's Zman chiyuva, right, that it's obligatory time and it creates all these prohibitions, then why shouldn't ideally be able to start that time? How can on the one hand you tell me that it's forbidden for me to start a huge meal because I have to daven Mincha, but then at the same time tell me that I shouldn't be davening Mincha now because it's not ideal? That's my question. Okay. The next question I had is a question that I wish I would have thought of myself. I thought about it when I was doing this years ago. I thought about this question, and my father thought about this and sent it to me. And I want to go through it. It wasn't in the introductory shiur, and I apologize, but I only got the question late on after my father went through the shiur. And he says this is the question. We have a halacha. It's a halacha based in psachim, but it's one of these halachos that are found. It's a principle of halacha that's found throughout the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Right? Now, on the 8th day, you should circumcise your son. Betanya, call Yom Kula, Kashal Minya. We have a brisa that says you can do bris milah any time of the day you want, as long as daytime. You can't do a bris milah at night. None of us have ever been invited to a bris milah at night. Bris milah is always done during the daylight hours, right? So you could do the whole day. Okay, I went to a bris yesterday. It was done after Shachar on Shabbos. It was done at I guess we went about 11 a.m. We went to the bris. Okay, so, but here it says Ela Zrizen Makdimin Lemitzos. We learned from Avram that when Avram went to do Akedas Yitzchak, when he went to sacrifice his son, so it says he got up very early in the morning. So we say that one should get up very, very early in the morning when they want to do any mitzvahs. So my father asked a very good question. He says if really we're supposed to be davening as early as we can, so then Mincha Gdula would seem to be the ideal time to daven. Right, based on this principle, right? Zrisin like the mitzvah. So I get up in the morning and I set up my schedule and I say, okay, what's the earliest time I could daven in the morning? Okay, Shachar is the earliest time, sunrise. Fine, sunrise. That's when I'm going to daven every morning. What's the earliest time I could daven Mincha? Zrisin like the mitzvah. The zealous people do their mitzvahs as early as possible. We learned it from Avraham Avinu. So that's when I should do it. I should do it as early as possible. So I'm going to put that Mincha Gdula, earliest time I could daven. But now the Rambam's going to say to me, no, that's not ideal. Ideal time is Mincha Ketana. So why doesn't Zrisin like the mitzvahs apply here? Okay. To answer our questions, we're going to look at Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah has an interesting idea. Okay, Rabbeinu Yonah says that really, what does it mean that our tefillos are in place of karbanos? So karbanos are the vehicle by which we attain atonement for our sins. Right, and he quotes David HaMelech, Hashem Svasai Tiftach, this is how we open our Shemona Esrei. Right, David HaMelech would pray to Hashem that his tefillah should be accepted because that's what's going to bring him forgiveness and atonement for his sins. So it seems to be that tefillah is in place of karbanos. We used to have karbanos, and now David HaMelech says, all I have are my tefillos because they're in place of their karbanos. Okay. Everybody sees that, right? We went into this. I apologize if anybody didn't watch the introductory share, and I'm sort of flying through this, but I explained a lot of this in the introductory share, and that's on YouTube if you want to see it, and go backwards. But in any case, okay. So understanding that the tefillos are in place of the karbanos. Let's move on from that point. Okay. Let's give an explanation as to what's happening with Mincha, okay, Mincha Gdula. How do we understand the best time for us to daven Mincha? How do we come to that explanation? How do we understand that? So the best time has to be in line with the karbanos, okay? The best time for us to daven has to be, when I say by in line, we're gonna flush out what that means in line, but it has to be that the best time for us to daven Mincha. Okay, and right, so and the ideal time for Mincha has to be in line with the karbanos. Okay, whenever time is ideal for me to give the korban, that's going to be the ideal time for me to daven Mincha. Okay, now let's explain that as we go through. Our first question was, what's the difference between being metakain, right, that we saw in the first source? Let's go back to that, right? So pardon me while I flip through. Right, we saw that the best time we saw the idea of that it was metakain on the right tefillos avos tiknun Asmechínהו rabbanan ar karbanos. Okay, so what does it mean that it was metakain, that it was set? Okay, so the rabbi set the amount of times and the time of prayers. Right, when was that? That was based on our forefathers. Okay, when they set up and they said really people should be praying every single day. And they should be praying more than once every single day. So then the Rabbanan said, okay, well, how do we determine how many times they should pray? How do we come to that? How do we conclude as to how many times a person should pray? Right? So they say, okay, we're going to look at our forefathers and see how many times they prayed. They prayed 3 times a day. So now the Jewish people should pray 3 times a day. When is the best time for them to pray? So they prayed morning, afternoon, and night. So too, we should pray morning, afternoon, and night. Okay, that was the takana. But the takana acted, and here's the mechanics of this halacha. The takana acted as an outline. Okay, it was a general outline. Okay, we knew morning, afternoon, and night. But there wasn't a specific time for what morning, afternoon, and night means. Where do we get the time? Where do we get the details of prayer? That comes from the korbanos. The details of the prayer, right? And that's what I mean by it has to be in line. Tefillah has to be in line with the korbanos. And this is what Asmechinu means, that they were somech, they were like reliant on the korbanos. What that means is that they looked to their korbanos and they said, okay, these are the details. This is how the details work. So then the machlokas between Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi here in the Gemara and Brachos, where it seems to be what they're sort of like, okay, well, just accept both opinions. It's not that they're accepting both opinions as sort of like some sort of compromise. What they're saying is that when the Rabbanan went to institute the prayers, they instituted them based on the amount of times and the exact times that the forefathers prayed. But when they went ahead and then said, okay, what are the details? What are the exact times, right? We're going to set exact times to this. So that was based on their korbanos. So when you say, okay, what's the ideal time to pray? The ideal time to pray is exactly as our forefathers prayed. Okay, but that leaves what to be answered, right? Then we need more than that. So then it should be in line with the korbanos. Okay, that's the idea. Okay. Okay, what's the debate about whether or not Mincha Gdula is ideal? Okay, so the question becomes really, and I think this goes back to what we're saying when we say that it's reliant on the korbanos, right, on the exact times of the korbanos. Okay, so how do we understand that when it comes to Mincha Gdula, right? How do we understand that? Because Mincha Gdula has two ideal times. Right? It seems a little strange. That's two ideal times. So how do we come to a conclusion on two ideal times? So really, I think what we're saying is, and give me a couple of minutes to explain this. But I think what we're saying when we say ideal times is there are two types of ideal times. Okay, there's the ideal time based on when the ideal time for the korban to be given was. And then there's the ideal time of when a person has entered sort of the zone of the time zone of the korban. There's the ideal time for prayer, and that would be Mincha Ketana. Then there's the time zone of Mincha. The time zone of Mincha begins at Mincha Gdula. Okay, that's the time zone. Now these two separate halachos, these two separate dinim, the time zone and the ideal time, right? Mincha Gdula and Mincha Ketana, right? Those don't necessarily instruct one or the other. The debate is whether or not they do instruct one or the other. According to the Rambam, they don't instruct one to the other, meaning that just because it's now the time zone of Mincha, just because now is the time zone of Mincha, and doesn't mean that it's now the ideal time to pray, right? You've entered the time zone 100%, but that doesn't mean that you should begin praying now. According to the Tur, right, the Tur and the Rosh, as soon as you've entered this time zone, right, once you're in the time zone, then you're in the time zone. That's the ideal time to pray now. There's no difference. One instructs the other, right? And that's why, right, so that helps us understand the debate here. The debate here is how to understand the difference between the time zone and the ideal time. To the Tur, there's no real difference between Mincha Ketana and Mincha Gdula, right? There's no real practical difference. There will be in terms of the ending time of prayer, but in terms of the beginning time when you're allowed to start praying, there's no real difference between the two, right? Because once you've entered Zman, the time zone of Mincha, then you can start davening. According to the Rambam, no, there are two separate things here, okay? Which then helps us understand why it is when it comes to what we call like the Rambam's catch-22, right? Where it's the start of the Zman Chiyuv of davening Mincha, right? I can start the obligation of davening Mincha now, right? That has begun, right? The Zman Mincha, the obligation has begun to it, in which case it generates prohibitions. I now can't eat a large meal. I now can't get a haircut. All these different things, right? So, okay, but I still can't daven, yeah, because the Rambam says 100%. Just because you're in the time zone, that doesn't instruct when the best time for you to daven is. Mincha Gdola and Mincha Ketana are two separate things. So yes, once you're in the time zone, the Chachamim have instituted certain prohibitions so that when it comes time for the ideal time, you don't forget to daven, right? And yeah, you could somewhat rely on the time zone to pray if you had to, right? You would be Yotzei if you daven Mincha in this Mincha Gdola time because it is the time zone of Mincha, right? At certain times, you can daven Mincha at this time. But because the korban at certain times was given at that early hour. But that's not the ideal time for prayer. And just because you are in the time zone doesn't mean it's the ideal time to pray. Is that clear?
So the reason that we're davening Mincha, ideally at Mincha Tana, is because that's when the korban was brought. And the korban was brought.
The usual time, right. The usual time for the korban was then.
Right. And the reason for that was a matter of operational functioning of the Beis HaMikdash? Why wasn't the korban brought earlier?
Korban Tamid Shel Better Mind. We're going to get to this when it comes to Zrisin Makdimin Mitzvos in a second. But I'll give you 1 second and I'll explain it. Okay. Let's go on to our fourth question. Our fourth question was based on the Gemara in Psachim that talks about Zrisin Makdimin Mitzvos. My father's question of why not always daven Mincha Gedola? Why is that not the ideal time? So Zrisin Makdimin Mitzvos only applies when it is the time of the mitzvah. Okay. So the question is, what is the time of the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim? What is the time? If I would ask you what the time is, right? So we would give two possible answers here, right? You could say, well, it must be Mincha Gedola because on Erev Pesach that fell on Erev Shabbos, that's when the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim was given. So therefore, that must be the ideal time for it. Or you could go ahead and say, no, the ideal time for the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim was as late in the afternoon as possible. It's what Bein Harabayim means, right? Bein Harabayim ideally should be as close to Bein Hashmashos, between the time between sunset and the stars come out, right? That's the ideal time for it, right? Yeah, we give it a little before that, right? We have to give it a little before that to make sure that that there's enough time and everything, right? You can't give it past sunset, but that's the ideal time for the mitzvah. So if I maintain that the ideal time for the korban Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim, if I maintain that time is at the 9.5 hours in, right? If that's what I'm maintaining, so then if I would come to you and say, but what about Zrisin Makdimin Mitzvos? I say no, Zrisin Makdimin Mitzvos only applies insofar as it's the time of the mitzvah. But if I would go ahead and trade in, quote unquote, trade in the value of the ideal time of the korban for the ideal time of mitzvahs, it doesn't make any sense. Because now what I'm doing is I'm saying, Zrisin Makdimin Mitzvos, right? I got to do this as fast as possible, as early as possible, not fast, as early as possible. But it's not the ideal time for the mitzvah. So I can't do it in its less than ideal time because I want to do it as early as possible. I should do it as early as possible in its most ideal time. In other words, the Chachamim came along and they said that the Tfilos Mincha is going to be set up based on the Avos. And then we're going to rely on the details on the Karbanos. So if the ideal time for the Korban is Ben Harabayim, right? That's when it was set. That's what it's called, the Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim. If that is what the Korban is, that's its nature, is that it must be given late in the afternoon, right? So then I can't do it earlier, because then I'm not fulfilling the mitzvah in its proper time. So it could be that when it comes to mitzvahs, I should do them as early as possible, but only when I'm doing the mitzvah in its most ideal state, right? That's the idea of using like the mitzvahs, and I'll give a proof, right? So when we say that there are daylight mitzvahs, the mitzvahs that have to be done during the daylight, right? There's a whole series of mitzvahs that the Mishnayos and Megillah talk about, things that are only kosher during the yom, that can only be done during the day. So there's a debate in halacha as to when the day starts. Does day start at dawn, what's called olos hashachar, or does the day start at hanetz hachama, at sunrise, right? Which one? So the reason why there's confusion is because in the Beis HaMikdash, the day started at olos hashachar, right? In our days, right, where we count as daytime, we start at hanetz hachama. That's what we say is daylight hours. Now, we are able, in cases of emergency, right, or difficult times, we are able to rely on dawn for those daylight mitzvahs. So for instance, if it's per morning and I have to hear Megillah and I have to go to work that day, or I have a trip somewhere, or whatever reason, I can't wait until sunrise to hear the Megillah, I could hear it from dawn and on. Now, if our question was correct in saying that zrisin makdimin lemitzos should apply over and above the ideal time for the mitzvah, then all these daylight mitzvahs that we have that can only be done during the daylight we should be starting at Olos HaShachar. We shouldn't be starting at Hanetz HaChama, because that would be the earliest time we could do it. But we say, no, that's not how we look at it. What we say is that we look at what the ideal time for the mitzvah is, and then within the ideal time for the mitzvah, start as early as possible. That all makes sense according to the Rambam. So that's why zrisin makdimin lemitzvos doesn't make any sense here, right? To say according to the Rambam, because the Rambam is going to say, because it's the ideal time. The ideal time is so do it at the earliest point in the ideal time is when you should daven mincha. So you shouldn't wait till 9 hours, 9.5 hours, 9 hours and 35 minutes into the day. You should start davening at 9 hours and 30 minutes into the day. That's when you should. That's when you should say you should daven. But I do really think that according to the Torah, no one agrees with me, and I haven't seen anybody write this, but I think that according to the Torah, who says that Mincha Gdula is ideal, right? Davening from 6.5 hours is ideal. And davening at 9.5 hours is there's no added benefit to that. So I think he would say that you should probably, I imagine he would say you should daven at the earliest possible time that you can daven mincha at 6.5 hours. You shouldn't wait. That's, I'd say, according to the Torah. I don't know for sure if that's true, but that's what I would say.
Rabbi, isn't the fact that there's a prohibition to do certain things before mincha, like eating, isn't that problematic for the Torah? If he says the ideal time is at 6.5 hours, then there wouldn't be any prohibitions. Like, in a way, the prohibitions prove that the Rambam's right, that this is an ideal time is at 9.5 hours, because the Torah would say prohibitions, like, this is the ideal time. We don't even, what is this prohibition stuff? Like, at 6.5 hours, you daven. Like, the fact that there's prohibitions shows that the ideal time must be after 6.5 hours.
It's interesting that you look at it. I look at it the exact opposite. I look at it like, okay, I should be starting to daven, let's say at 12:30, right? I should be starting to daven at 12:30. That's Mincha Gdula. So now, for whatever reason, I'm not davening, but you better make sure that you're not getting involved in anything too big, because then you're going to completely forget to daven at all. So that's why the prohibitions are put there. I see the prohibitions as more, we have to do these gymnastics to come out and understand the Rambam by saying that the time zone of Mincha doesn't instruct the ideal time. To the Torah, it makes perfect sense. The minute that the time zone starts, I now become worried. Once the alarm hits at 12:30, I say I should be davening now. Okay, I'm in the middle of a meeting. I can't daven right now. So then now I'm worried. Maybe I'm going to come to forget to daven at all. So that during that entire time until I daven, I can't do anything that could possibly distract me too much.
But there wouldn't be a prohibition in the first place, because, of course, you couldn't start your meal until you daven. So it wouldn't say, okay, don't do this meal because you might forget to daven. As soon as that would have to be before the 6.5 hours that he said, don't start the meal. Don't start the meal at 5.5 hours because you may forget it at 6.5 hours. But he couldn't say, don't start the meal at 6.5 hours because you might forget. What do you mean you might forget? You're supposed to be davening right now.
Right. So now that I start
before.
Right. So I'm saying, so for whatever reason, I can't daven now, but I can't be doing anything that's going to be too distracting. That would be the issue. I'm just looking at it the exact opposite way that you're seeing it, right? It's true what you're saying. You see, I think what you're looking at is that there could be only two possibilities: I'm davening or I'm not davening.
Right.
So I'm saying that there's a third possibility. There's three possibilities. There's I'm davening. Okay, good. We both agree on that one. Then there's I'm not davening, but it's acceptable that I'm not davening, right? And
but the Torah doesn't say it's acceptable.
Well, no. So the Torah says you should ideally start davening now. But what if for whatever reason you're not, let's say I started a meal at 11 a.m. So then the halacha is that I'm allowed to continue my meal. Right? I'm allowed to continue I don't have to stop my meal in order to start davening, right? So now what I am worried about though is that I'm going to start doing something that's going to be too big of a distraction. So that, right, that's the third, that's the third like type of thing where I don't think you're taking into consideration. So that's that third, you know, state of being, that state of existence. That's what we were worried about.
Okay.
Right. That's the idea. So that's what generates the prohibitions, right? Because I'm not davening beheter. I'm not davening. I'm allowed to not daven at this point. But I can't do something that would then be so distracting that I might then go ahead and forget to daven. That the Chacham are going to say no, you can't do that. Okay, that's the shiur for today. We got to start getting more people. I apologize for the hour change. I just like I hope it worked out better for you. I just I don't know, but I hope that this works out better. I hope we can get more people. But that's we'll see.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Ezra.
According to the Rambam, when do the prohibitions start? Do they also start at Mincha?
Yeah, he said he's gdula, right? That was our whole thing. That
right. So how does he explain that?
So that's what we were talking about. That the Rambam is going to say that just that the Zman chiyuva, the time zone of Mincha, doesn't instruct the ideal time to daven. But what it does is once you hit the time zone, then we start worrying that you're going to forget to daven. So that's
even though you shouldn't be davening then, even though you should wait till the ideal time.
Exactly. It's confusing, right? Because I've got 3.5 hours until I can start davening, right? But at the same time, right? So we begin to worry that you're going to forget to daven, but it's not the ideal time. The two don't instruct each other. Okay. Great. Okay. So see each other next week, Bezos Hashem, and I'll send out source sheets and videos and everything doing that there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.